My name is Liam, and I am 33 years old. For 10 years, I bled for my country in the Special Forces, sending every single paycheck back home to the father I trusted to build my future. But when I returned home with a shattered leg and asked for my money to pay for my surgery, my own father looked me dead in the eye, laughed, and threw me out into the freezing snow. He told me I was a useless burden. He thought I was just a broken soldier with nothing left to my name. What he did not know was that the bus I boarded that night was about to take me straight to the one man who held the key to destroying his entire empire. I survived 3 brutal combat deployments as an Army Ranger medic, only to realize my most dangerous enemies were sitting right across my own family dining table. Before I share exactly how I legally took back everything they stole from me, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who only valued your money and never loved you. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the massive dining table, but the atmosphere inside my home was ice cold. It was Christmas Eve. The table was covered in expensive catered food, expensive wine, and my medical bills. A piece of crumpled paper hit me square in the chest and dropped onto my empty plate. I looked up. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table adjusting the cuffs of his suit. $4,000 for physical therapy, my father sneered. His harsh voice carried across the silent dining room. You have been back for 3 months, Liam, and all you do is drain our resources. I am not paying this bill. I stared at the paper, then looked at my leg. Enemy shrapnel had shattered my tibia during my last deployment, leaving me with a severe limp and chronic pain. I gripped the table edge to steady my hands. I am not asking for a handout, Dad, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm. I am asking for my own money. For 10 years, I sent $4,000 home every month. That is almost $500,000. You promised you were putting it into a joint investment fund for my future. I need that money now for my surgery. My younger sister Olivia rolled her eyes loudly. She sat swirling her expensive champagne glass draped in the designer clothes our parents had happily bought for her. Oh my God, Liam, Olivia groaned. Can you stop ruining the holiday mood? Jamal and I just got our new Ferrari delivered today, and your depressing medical talk is killing my vibe. Her husband Jamal chuckled while slicing his steak. As an African-American man from a privileged background, he prided himself on his flashy lifestyle. Look, man, Jamal said, pointing his knife at me. In business, investments go bad all the time. Markets crash, projects fold. I know you Army guys do not understand how real money works, but you need to grow up and stop crying over spilled milk. I ignored Jamal completely and kept my eyes locked on my father. Where is my money, Dad? I asked again. My father scoffed and took a slow sip of his wine. The money is gone, Liam. I put it into a real estate project downtown and it went bankrupt. Every penny was lost. It is your own fault for not managing your finances better. I am not a charity, and this house is not a hospital for broken soldiers. You lost $500,000 of my combat pay, I stated. My voice was dangerously quiet. And now you are refusing to help me pay for the surgery I desperately need to walk properly again. I am saying you are a burden, my father replied coldly. You bring down the energy of this family. I have important investors coming over tomorrow, and I will not have a crippled failure limping around my house making us look pathetic. Pack your bags and get out tonight. I looked at my mother, Susan. She sat quietly at the other end of the table, avoiding my gaze. She just took another bite of her salad, choosing to protect her comfortable lifestyle rather than defend her wounded son. They had all made their choice. I did not yell or flip the table. My military training had taught me how to stay rational in the face of absolute betrayal. I simply nodded, stood up, and grabbed my cane. I limped out of the dining room without saying another word. I went upstairs to the small guest room. It took me exactly 10 minutes to pack my tactical backpack. I did not take anything they had bought. I only took what I had earned. When I walked back down the stairs, I could hear them laughing in the dining room, moving on as if I had never existed in their perfect world. I stepped out the front door and the freezing winter wind hit me instantly. The snow was falling heavily, covering the manicured lawns of their affluent neighborhood. My shattered leg throbbed with blinding pain with every single agonizing step, but I forced myself to keep walking. I walked through the dark blizzard until I finally reached the Greyhound bus station downtown. I bought a one-way ticket heading to the countryside. I was going to the only safe place I had left in this cold world. I was going to see my grandfather Harrison at his rural farm. I truly thought my life was over right then and there, but I had absolutely no idea that the cold bus ride was actually the beginning of my ultimate revenge. The brutal karma they absolutely deserved was coming for them. The tires of the Greyhound bus hummed a monotonous rhythm against the icy asphalt. I sat near the back, pressing my forehead against the freezing glass window, watching the city lights blur into the desolate darkness of the highway. The heater on the bus was broken, blowing only lukewarm air over my shivering frame. My shattered leg throbbed with a relentless burning ache, a constant reminder of the combat zone I had barely survived. I popped 2 ibuprofen dry, swallowing them, and gripped my cane. The physical pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the crushing weight of betrayal settling in my chest. I had given them everything. As the miles stretched on, my mind drifted back to the scorching deserts of the Middle East. I remembered the deafening sound of mortar fire, the acrid smell of burning fuel, and the sheer terror of pulling wounded men to safety under heavy enemy contact. During those long, brutal deployments, my only tether to sanity was the thought of the future I was building back home. Every single month, without fail, when my combat pay hit my account, I would trudge to the makeshift communication tent. I would log onto the incredibly slow satellite internet and wire exactly $4,000 to my father. He called the account the Horizon Fund. He sent me elaborate emails filled with complex charts and graphs, promising that my money was securing prime commercial real estate. He told me I was building an ironclad safety net for my eventual return to civilian life. I trusted him completely. He was a wealthy real estate developer, and he was my father. Why would I ever doubt his financial advice? While I was patching up bullet wounds and eating military rations, my family was living a life of absolute luxury. Whenever I managed to get a brief video call back home, Olivia would proudly display her new designer handbags or talk endlessly about her upcoming vacations to Paris and Milan. Jamal always hovered in the background, wearing custom-tailored suits, boasting about his supposedly massive success in the investment world. My mother would constantly complain about the stress of managing their multiple country club memberships. They painted a picture of immense prosperity and elite status. I naively assumed their wealth came from their own hard work and brilliant business maneuvers. I never once suspected that the foundation of their lavish lifestyle was actually built on the blood money I was wiring home from a war zone. I was the perfect mark. I was a loyal soldier who asked absolutely no questions and blindly followed his father's directives. I felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me as the reality of my own foolishness settled in. The sky was turning a bruised shade of purple by the time the bus finally ground to a halt. The driver announced the rural stop, and I carefully navigated my way down the steep steps of the bus. The freezing morning air bit into my lungs. The heavy doors hissed shut, and the bus roared away down the highway, leaving me completely alone on the edge of a snow-covered dirt road. The silence of the countryside was absolute. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic battlefield I knew so well, and the toxic screaming match I had just escaped in the city. I adjusted the thick strap of my heavy tactical backpack, letting it dig into my shoulder, and began the slow, agonizing trek up the long driveway. Every step required intense mental focus. The cold seeped through my boots, aggravating the severe nerve damage in my leg. But the sight of the old wooden farmhouse in the distance gave me the strength to push forward. Grandpa Harrison's farm stood exactly as I remembered it from my childhood. The weathered barn, the sprawling pastures blanketed in pristine white snow, and the sturdy farmhouse with smoke curling gently from the stone chimney. It was a place of hard work and honest living, entirely divorced from the pretentious elite circles my parents obsessed over. I climbed the wooden porch steps, leaning heavily on my cane, and knocked firmly on the solid oak door. Less than a minute later, the door swung open. Harrison stood there wearing his faded red flannel shirt and worn denim jeans. At 82 years old, he was still an imposing figure, with broad shoulders and a sharp, intelligent gaze that missed absolutely nothing. He looked at my snow-covered jacket. He looked at the heavy cane keeping me upright. He looked at the deep, exhausted circles under my eyes. He did not ask what I was doing there at dawn on Christmas Day. He did not ask why I was freezing and alone. He just stepped aside and opened the door wider. I stepped into the profound warmth of the house. The smell of burning oak and fresh coffee filled the air, instantly soothing my frayed nerves. Harrison quietly took my frozen coat and pointed toward the worn leather armchair positioned right next to the roaring fireplace. I sank into the chair, letting the heat seep into my aching bones. A moment later, he handed me a steaming mug of black coffee. We sat in total silence for a long time. It was a silence filled with mutual understanding and unconditional support. In his house, I was not a burden or a broken investment. I was just his grandson. I closed my eyes, taking my first real breath since I stepped off the transport plane 3 months ago. I felt safe, but that brief sanctuary was about to be shattered by a revelation I never saw coming. The mug of coffee warmed my scarred hands, but the chill of my father's rejection remained lodged deep in my chest. I stared at the dancing flames in the hearth, struggling to find the right words. I had faced hostile fire and improvised explosive devices without flinching, but admitting my own profound gullibility to my grandfather felt like swallowing broken glass. I finally broke the heavy silence. I told Harrison everything. I explained the 10 years of wire transfers. I detailed the Horizon Fund my father had promised to manage. I recounted the brutal Christmas Eve dinner, the claim of total bankruptcy, the mocking from Olivia and Jamal, and the absolute lack of hesitation when my father threw his wounded son out into a blizzard. I braced myself for a look of pity, or perhaps a lecture on financial naivety. Harrison did not offer pity. His rugged face hardened into a mask of pure, cold fury. He set his mug down on the wooden side table with a sharp thud that echoed through the quiet room. He stood up without a single word and walked over to a massive iron safe tucked into the corner of the living room. I watched in confusion as he spun the combination dial. The heavy steel door clicked open. Harrison reached inside and pulled out a thick, bulging manila folder. He walked back to my chair and dropped the heavy file directly onto my lap. "Open it," Harrison commanded. His voice was low and gravelly, carrying an edge of absolute authority. "Your father did not lose your money in a bad real estate deal, Liam. He stole it." I opened the folder. The first few pages were highly detailed bank statements and forensic accounting records. I immediately recognized the routing numbers from my military accounts. Next to them were the receiving accounts controlled by my father. The documents painted a crystal-clear picture of systematic financial abuse. Harrison pointed a weathered finger at a series of massive withdrawals dated 3 years ago. "Look at those transfers," Harrison said. "That money did not go into any commercial real estate project. It went directly into an offshore account controlled by your brother-in-law, Jamal. That flashy investment fund Jamal always brags about is nothing but a glorified Ponzi scheme. He was bleeding his wealthy clients dry to fund his own extravagant lifestyle. When the market dipped and his investors demanded their returns, Jamal panicked. He was facing immediate federal fraud charges and a lengthy prison sentence. Your father could not stomach the public humiliation of having his son-in-law arrested. He cared more about his elite social standing than his own flesh and blood. So Richard drained your combat pay to quietly bail Jamal out of a multi-million-dollar hole." I stared at the highlighted numbers, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. My own father had financed a criminal cover-up using the money I earned while dragging wounded soldiers through the dirt. I flipped to the next page and the nausea returned with a vengeance. These records detailed where the rest of the money had gone over the past few months. "The remaining balance did not sit in a savings account," Harrison continued relentlessly, Richard funneled it directly to Olivia. That brand new Ferrari they flaunted at dinner tonight was purchased with a wire transfer that exactly matches your last massive deposit. Those trips to Paris, those designer clothes, those country club fees you paid for every single one of them. While you were taking shrapnel to the leg, they were using your blood money to play royalty. The raw despair I had felt on the bus rapidly evaporated. In its place, a dark, violent rage began to boil in my veins. My hands shook violently as I gripped the edges of the folder. I had sacrificed my youth, my safety, and my physical health for a family that viewed me entirely as a disposable bank account. They had stolen my future, and then had the sheer audacity to call me a useless burden when the well ran dry. I grabbed my heavy wooden cane, my knuckles turning stark white from the pressure. A dangerous thought crossed my mind. I wanted to march right back to that sprawling mansion, kick down the front door, and tear their perfect illusion to absolute shreds. Harrison watched the violent storm brewing in my eyes. He placed a heavy, grounding hand firmly on my shoulder. "Calm down, Liam," Harrison said softly. "That is what your father thinks happened. That is the reality he has been living in for the past 8 years." I looked up at him, completely confused. "What do you mean that is what he thinks happened?" Harrison reached down and flipped the stack of papers over, revealing a completely different set of legal documents. These papers bore the official seal of a top-tier financial institution. "Your father is an arrogant man, but he is a sloppy criminal," Harrison explained with a dark, satisfying smirk. 8 years ago, I noticed some strange irregularities in his business filings. I still hold significant power and advisory rights at the primary bank he uses. I ordered a quiet audit of his accounts and discovered his plan to siphon your military pay. I knew confronting him would only make me lose the element of surprise. So I did something much more effective. Harrison tapped the heavily embossed legal document. "I used my authority at the bank to intercept every single wire transfer you sent from overseas. The money Richard has been spending for the past 8 years, the money he used to bail out Jamal and buy Olivia her luxury toys, was not your money. I quietly redirected his incoming funds and replaced them with predatory, high-interest corporate loans taken out against his own development company. He has been spending borrowed bank money while racking up massive debt under his own corporate signature." My mind struggled to process the magnitude of what my grandfather was telling me. "If he was spending bank money, then where did my combat pay go?" Harrison smiled. It was the smile of a master tactician who had flawlessly executed a long game. "I took every penny of your actual money and placed it into a secure, irrevocable trust under your name. Your money grew untouched and protected. 2 years ago, I used the capital in that trust to execute a major acquisition. I bought the commercial land deeds located right in the center of the financial district." I stared at him in pure shock. "The financial district? You mean the land underneath Horizon Plaza?" "Exactly," Harrison confirmed. "Horizon Plaza is the crown jewel of your father's real estate empire. He spent tens of millions building that massive complex, but he does not own the dirt it sits on. He only leases the land. And thanks to the trust I set up, the legal owner of that land, the landlord who holds absolute power over your father's entire corporate existence, is you, Liam. You own the ground beneath his feet." The sheer brilliance of the trap left me completely speechless. The burning anger in my chest suddenly shifted into a cold, calculating focus. My father thought he had discarded a broken, penniless soldier. He had no idea he had just thrown out the one man who held the absolute power to legally obliterate his entire world. I sat in the worn leather armchair, letting the magnitude of my grandfather's words wash over me. For 10 years, I had operated in high-stakes combat zones, relying on tactical precision to survive catastrophic situations. Now the battlefield had shifted from the scorching desert to corporate boardrooms and binding legal contracts, but the fundamental rules of engagement remained exactly the same. You identify the hostile enemy, you locate their critical weakness, and you strike with overwhelming force when they are most vulnerable. Harrison did not waste a single second letting me wallow in the shock of this newfound power. He picked up his vintage desk phone and made a brief muted call. Less than an hour later, the sound of heavy tires crunching on the snow-covered driveway signaled the arrival of our final tactical asset. Attorney Mitchell stepped into the warm farmhouse, vigorously brushing white snowflakes from his dark wool overcoat. He was a sharp-featured man in his late 50s, possessing a quiet intensity that immediately commanded respect. He had served as my grandfather's personal legal counsel for over 2 decades, flawlessly handling the most complex asset protection strategies for the wealthiest families in the state. Mitchell shook my hand firmly, taking a seat directly opposite the roaring fireplace, and instantly pulled a thick stack of legal binders from his leather briefcase. "It is a privilege to finally meet you, Liam," Mitchell said, his voice crisp and strictly professional. "Your grandfather has been meticulously preparing for this exact moment for 8 long years. Let us review the primary weapon in our arsenal." Mitchell opened the first heavy binder and slid it across the wooden coffee table. "This is the irrevocable trust established entirely in your name. An irrevocable trust means that once the assets are placed inside, they absolutely cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the explicit written permission of the named beneficiary. That beneficiary is exclusively you. Your father cannot touch it. The banks cannot seize it. It is an absolute, impenetrable financial fortress holding the singular most valuable piece of commercial real estate in your father's entire corporate portfolio." I leaned forward carefully, studying the dense legal jargon highlighting the ownership transfer of the commercial dirt beneath Horizon Plaza. I needed to understand the exact mechanics of the financial trap we were about to spring. "If I own the land underneath his building, how does that directly affect his daily operations?" I asked, looking between the two older men. Mitchell smiled, a predatory grin that matched my grandfather's perfectly. "In commercial real estate development, companies rarely actually own the land they build upon," Mitchell explained, tapping the paper. "They secure a commercial ground lease, usually spanning several decades. They build their massive skyscrapers on that leased dirt, and then use the projected revenue from those buildings to secure massive high-interest bank loans. Your father's company currently holds a ground lease for Horizon Plaza." Harrison leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "Tell him about the expiration date, Mitchell." The lawyer tapped a specific bolded clause in the contract with his silver pen. "Your father's current ground lease for Horizon Plaza expires in exactly 1 month. In order to maintain his bank loans and keep his company afloat, he absolutely must secure a lease renewal from the anonymous trust that owns the land. If the trust refuses to renew the lease, your father's company loses all rights to the property. The building legally reverts to the landowner. The banks will immediately call in his massive predatory debts, and his entire real estate empire will instantly collapse into total unrecoverable bankruptcy." The physical pain in my shattered leg seemed to evaporate as the brilliant reality of the situation locked into place. For the first time since returning from my deployment, I did not feel broken or defeated. I felt dangerous. The profound sense of victimhood that had suffocated me on that freezing bus ride vanished. I stopped seeing myself as the discarded son seeking approval from a toxic father. I was a highly trained military operator, and my targets had blindly marched themselves directly into a fatal kill zone. Richard, Susan, Olivia, and Jamal had built their entire arrogant identity on the illusion of superiority and immense wealth. I was not just going to quietly take my money back. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire false reality brick by brick. "What about Jamal and Olivia?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, steady cadence. "They were driving a brand new Ferrari bought with the bank loans my father took out to cover his theft. How do we ensure they face the maximum fallout?" Mitchell adjusted his glasses, pulling up another complex financial schematic. "Jamal's fraudulent investment fund is highly leveraged against his personal assets, which are currently legally intertwined with your father's corporate collateral. Because your father used high-interest loans to fund their lavish lifestyle, every single luxury item they own, including their expensive cars, their mansion, and their investment portfolios, is tied directly to the survival of Horizon Plaza. When you pull the plug on the land lease, the resulting financial shockwave will trigger a catastrophic default across all their linked accounts. The bank will ruthlessly repossess everything Jamal and Olivia claim to own." We spent the next several hours mapping out the precise execution of our strategy. I needed to remain completely hidden as the true owner of the trust until the absolute final second. Mitchell advised that we let my father frantically scramble to negotiate with the anonymous trust, stringing him along to drastically increase his financial desperation. We needed him to commit even further to his illusion of success, perhaps pushing him to attempt a desperate corporate merger to save his sinking ship. The more confident he felt, the harder the eventual devastating impact would be. I stood up from the armchair, testing my full weight on my injured leg. The pain was still there, a sharp bite of damaged nerves, but I welcomed it now. It was a tangible reminder of what I had survived and what I was fully capable of enduring. My family had viewed my military service as a foolish pursuit, completely oblivious to the extreme mental conditioning it required. They thought I was a naive foot soldier who could be easily manipulated and casually discarded. They were about to learn a brutal, unforgiving lesson about the severe consequences of underestimating a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Harrison watched me pace the living room, a look of profound pride settling over his weathered features. We had the legal ammunition, we had the element of ultimate surprise, and we had the perfect timeline to execute the financial strike. The reckoning was no longer a desperate fantasy born of grief and betrayal. It was a concrete mathematical certainty ticking down like a synchronized explosive charge. I looked at the finalized legal documents resting heavily on the oak table. The board was set and the pieces were locked into their inevitable positions. We were fully prepared for war, but fate was about to deal us a devastating blow that would force me to execute this mission entirely alone. The brutal winter dragged on, but the intense strategic planning sessions with my grandfather provided a sharp, fiery focus that completely consumed my days. We spent 3 weeks analyzing every single financial vulnerability in my father's corporate structure. Harrison was a relentless mentor, teaching me the intricate maneuvers of high-level real estate law with the exact same rigor my drill sergeants had used to teach me combat tactics. But the human body has limits that even the sharpest mind cannot overcome. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning. I woke up at dawn to the sound of utter silence. The familiar smell of roasting coffee beans that usually filled the old farmhouse was absent. I walked down the wooden stairs, my cane thumping rhythmically against the floorboards, and found Harrison sitting in his favorite leather armchair by the cold fireplace. His eyes were peacefully closed, and a worn leather-bound ledger rested gently on his lap. He had passed away quietly in his sleep. His heart simply stopped beating. I stood frozen in the doorway, the freezing reality of my isolation crashing down on me. The man who had saved me from the cold streets, who had single-handedly protected my financial future when my own parents threw me to the wolves, was gone. I did not cry. My time in the military had trained me to lock my grief away in a secure mental vault until the mission was complete. I approached his chair, checked his pulse, and then slowly reached out to close the ledger on his lap. I had lost my commanding officer, but the operation still had to proceed exactly as we planned. Attorney Mitchell handled the official proceedings, outlining that Harrison had left the farmhouse, the sprawling acres of agricultural land, and the modest farming equipment entirely to me. My family was legally notified of his passing and the subsequent inheritance. Because the massive irrevocable trust containing the Horizon Plaza land deed was a completely separate private financial entity, shielded by extreme corporate confidentiality, they remained completely blind to my actual wealth. To them, I was just the broken veteran who had inherited a worthless patch of dirt and a drafty old barn. The funeral was held 3 days later at a small rustic cemetery overlooking the valley. It was a modest, respectful gathering filled with local farmers, military veterans, and people who had genuinely respected the quiet dignity of my grandfather. The crisp winter air stung my face as I stood by the graveside, listening to the minister deliver the final rites. This quiet, solemn atmosphere was abruptly shattered by the aggressive crunching of tires on the gravel road. A fleet of 3 gleaming black luxury SUVs pulled directly up to the cemetery gates, completely disregarding the quiet ceremony. My father Richard stepped out of the lead vehicle, wearing a tailored Italian suit that easily cost more than a year of a soldier's salary. My mother Susan followed closely behind, wrapping a thick fur coat tightly around her shoulders and casting disgusted glances at the muddy ground. Olivia and Jamal emerged from the second vehicle, loudly complaining about the freezing temperature and the lack of paved walkways. They did not stand with the other mourners. They hovered near their expensive vehicles, treating the entire funeral like a minor inconvenience they were forced to endure for the sake of public appearances. When the service concluded, the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving me alone near the freshly turned earth. My father approached me, checking his gold watch as if timing the interaction. "Well, Liam," Richard said, his voice devoid of any actual sympathy, "I suppose congratulations are in order. You finally have a place to stay that will not drain my bank accounts. Try not to run this farm into the ground the way you managed your military career." My mother refused to even look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant tree line, complaining to Olivia about how the cold air was ruining her expensive skin treatments. Olivia simply scoffed, kicking a loose pebble with her designer boots. "Enjoy the cow manure, Liam," Olivia sneered. "I guess it suits you. Just do not expect us to visit this depressing wasteland." Jamal stepped forward, sliding his hands into the pockets of his custom-tailored cashmere coat. He looked around the modest agricultural property, with a deeply arrogant smirk playing across his face. As an executive who thrived on flashy corporate illusions, he viewed honest manual labor as entirely beneath him. "You guard this little dirt patch well, brother-in-law," Jamal mocked, flashing a condescending smile. "While you are out here playing farmer, the real adults are making history. Next week, your father's company is officially merging with the Vanguard Group. It is a $50 million corporate merger. We are going to be untouchable. I might even send a cheap case of beer out here so you can celebrate our success from your rusty tractor." They turned their backs on me without waiting for a response and piled back into their heated luxury vehicles. I stood perfectly still, leaning on my cane, and watched the black SUVs speed away, leaving a cloud of cold dust in their wake. They thought they had achieved ultimate victory. They truly believed they were stepping into an elite, untouchable echelon of wealth, entirely unaware that their massive $50 million merger depended entirely on a land lease renewal they did not possess. Attorney Mitchell stepped up beside me, his dark overcoat billowing slightly in the winter wind. He handed me a sealed black folder. "Vanguard requires the anonymous landowner's signature to finalize the merger," Mitchell said, his voice low and precise. "Your father's corporate attorneys have been frantically trying to contact my office to secure the lease renewal. They are growing desperate. Richard is planning a massive celebratory gala next week to finalize the Vanguard deal, and he expects the anonymous landowner to sign the paperwork there." I took the black folder from Mitchell, feeling the heavy weight of the legal contracts inside. The grief over losing my grandfather hardened into an unbreakable diamond of pure strategic resolve. My family thought I was nothing but a discarded burden bleeding out in a frozen wasteland. They had boldly mocked my survival and casually spat on the grave of the only man who had truly protected me. "Let them plan their perfect party," I said, staring down the empty gravel road where their cars had vanished. "Confirm with their legal team that the landowner will absolutely attend the gala to address the lease agreement directly. Prepare every single financial foreclosure document. We are going to let them stand on the highest pedestal possible right before we rip the foundation completely out from under them." Mitchell nodded firmly and turned back toward his vehicle. I walked slowly back to the empty farmhouse. The silence inside was deafening, but it was no longer a heavy burden. It was the absolute calm before a catastrophic storm. I sat at my grandfather's wooden desk and opened the heavy leather-bound ledger he had been holding when he died. Inside were decades of meticulous handwritten notes tracking every single deceptive move my father had made. Harrison had spent his final years tirelessly building a flawless legal weapon specifically designed for me to wield. I traced my fingers over his steady handwriting, making a silent promise to finish the mission he had started. I would not let my anger make me reckless. I would execute the final strike with the exact same cold, calculating precision my grandfather had taught me. I closed the ledger and locked it inside the iron safe. The time for mourning was officially over. Across the city, inside the sprawling walls of my parents' estate, the atmosphere was a toxic blend of manic energy and unchecked greed. Richard stood in his expansive home office, pouring himself a glass of extremely expensive aged scotch. He stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured grounds of his property, feeling like a conquering emperor. The Vanguard merger was just days away, and the promise of a $50 million payout had completely intoxicated him. He took a slow, satisfied sip of the amber liquid, savoring the taste of impending absolute victory. In his mind, he was no longer just a wealthy developer. He was about to become a legitimate titan of the real estate industry. He picked up his gold-plated smartphone and dialed his lead corporate attorney demanding updates on the gala preparations with the aggressive arrogance of a man who believed he owned the entire world. He yelled at his staff, threatening to fire anyone who made even a minor mistake. Richard felt untouchable, completely insulated by his own bloated ego. In the grand foyer of the mansion, Susan was aggressively directing a team of exhausted interior decorators and event planners. She barked orders with a sharp, condescending tone, completely dismissing their professional suggestions. The merger gala had to be the most extravagant social event the city had ever witnessed. She demanded imported white orchids draped over every available surface and insisted on securing a private string quartet flown in exclusively from Europe. Susan swiped her platinum credit card without a single second of hesitation, covering exorbitant premium charges to ensure her wealthy friends would be consumed with blinding jealousy. She viewed this party as her ultimate coronation into elite high society. The fact that she was currently paying for these lavish floral arrangements using heavily leveraged corporate credit did not bother her in the slightest. The Vanguard money was practically already in her bank account as far as she was concerned. She strutted through the hallways, treating the hired help like absolute garbage. Upstairs in the master guest suite, Olivia and Jamal were engaged in their own grotesque celebration of unearned wealth. Jamal stood in front of a massive gilded mirror, wearing a bespoke silk suit that had been custom-tailored for the upcoming gala. As an ambitious African-American executive who desperately craved the validation of the financial elite, he viewed the Vanguard merger as his ultimate golden ticket. His fraudulent investment fund was currently drowning in millions of dollars of hidden debt, but he felt zero panic. Jamal fully expected his father-in-law to clear his shady ledgers the moment the Vanguard contract was signed. He adjusted his expensive diamond cufflinks, flashing a brilliantly arrogant smile at his own reflection. He genuinely believed his manipulative business tactics made him an absolute genius. He admired his expensive watch, calculating exactly how much more money he could siphon once the Vanguard deal closed. Olivia lounged on a velvet chaise across the room, sipping expensive champagne, while scrolling through luxury real estate listings on her tablet. She was completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial cliff she was currently standing on. She casually flicked her perfectly manicured finger across the screen, bookmarking a massive beachfront property in the Bahamas. She enthusiastically told Jamal they should buy it in cash immediately following the gala. Olivia was already planning how she would decorate the tropical villa and which high society friends she would invite to flaunt her immense new wealth. She firmly believed that being born into Richard's family inherently entitled her to a lifetime of endless luxury and absolute ease. The concept of actual hard work or severe consequences was entirely foreign to her pampered existence. She took another long sip of champagne, dreaming of private jets and endless shopping sprees. Later that evening, the four of them gathered in the formal dining room for a celebratory pre-gala dinner. They toasted to their own brilliance, clinking heavy crystal glasses filled with imported wine. The conversation quickly shifted to the only minor annoyance left on their perfect horizon: the anonymous landowner of Horizon Plaza. Richard laughed dismissively, waving his silver fork in the air as he explained the situation to Jamal. Richard boasted that the secretive trust holding the land deed was clearly managed by a timid old money coward who was too afraid to show his face. Richard proudly announced that his legal team had finally cornered the elusive owner, forcing an agreement that the lease renewal would be signed live at the gala. Richard was absolutely certain he held all the negotiating power. He genuinely thought the landowner was just a minor administrative hurdle standing between him and his $50 million payday. He bragged about how he was going to force the owner into a terrible deal. Susan gracefully dabbed her mouth with a silk napkin and steered the conversation toward a subject that brought them all immense, cruel satisfaction. They began to gleefully mock my current situation. Olivia laughed, recounting how pathetic I looked leaning on my cane at the cemetery, standing in the freezing mud like a broken peasant. Jamal chuckled deeply, taking another large bite of his rare steak. He confidently proclaimed that giving me the worthless farm was the smartest tactical move Richard had ever made. They firmly agreed that discarding a wounded military veteran was entirely justified because I simply did not fit their glamorous aesthetic. They viewed my severe physical injuries and decade of military sacrifice as nothing more than an embarrassing family secret they had successfully swept under a dirty rural rug. They joked that I would probably freeze to death in that old barn before spring. They sat around their massive dining table, gorging themselves on premium food and arrogant delusions, completely blind to the financial slaughterhouse waiting for them. Richard genuinely believed he had successfully stolen my combat pay to build his empire without facing a single consequence. Jamal honestly thought his massive financial crimes would be permanently erased by his father-in-law's newly acquired wealth. Olivia and Susan were entirely convinced their status as wealthy elites was permanently cemented in stone. They were actively celebrating their own impending execution. They had absolutely no idea that the anonymous landowner they were eagerly expecting at the gala was the exact same discarded son they were currently mocking. The trap was set, the bait was swallowed, and they were aggressively pulling the trigger on their own total destruction. While my family busied themselves with their pathetic delusions of grandeur, I was locked in a completely different kind of battle. The sun had not even crested the horizon when my alarm violently buzzed in the freezing farmhouse. I threw off the heavy wool blankets and immediately swung my legs over the edge of the bed. The cold morning air bit at my skin, but I ignored it, focusing entirely on the thick, jagged scar running down my right shin. The enemy shrapnel had torn through muscle and chipped the bone, leaving a web of severe nerve damage that flared with a blinding white-hot agony every single morning. I gripped the mattress tightly, taking a slow, measured breath. In the military, you learn that pain is simply information leaving your body. I refused to let that pain dictate my future. I grabbed my truck keys and drove down the icy rural roads toward the city limits. I pulled into the small parking lot of a specialized rehabilitation clinic long before their official opening hours. Dr. Carter was already waiting for me inside. He was a heavily built man in his late 40s and a former combat medic himself. He possessed a relentless, unapologetic demeanor that perfectly matched my own intense drive. Dr. Carter did not offer coddling or gentle encouragement. He operated his clinic like a military training ground, demanding absolute maximum effort from his patients regardless of their physical limitations. I respected him immensely for that exact reason. "Get on the table, Liam," Dr. Carter barked, pointing toward the padded examination bench. "We are pushing the load limit today. If you want to walk into that corporate gala without heavily leaning on that wooden cane, you need to endure the fire right now." I stripped off my jacket and climbed onto the table, preparing myself for the incoming torture. Dr. Carter began aggressively manipulating the damaged tissue surrounding my knee and ankle joints. He pushed my leg past its comfortable range of motion, forcing the stiffened muscles to stretch and tear slightly to rebuild stronger fibers. A sharp, involuntary grunt escaped my lips as fire shot up my thigh. "Breathe through it, soldier," Dr. Carter commanded, pressing his thumbs directly into the thickest part of the scar tissue. "You survived heavy artillery fire in the desert. A little physical therapy is an absolute walk in the park. Push against my hand." I gritted my teeth, locking my jaw so hard it ached, and pushed my damaged leg against his unrelenting resistance. Sweat immediately beaded on my forehead, rolling down my neck and soaking the collar of my gray shirt. My entire body trembled violently under the extreme exertion, but I absolutely refused to quit. As the burning sensation threatened to overwhelm my senses, my mind sharply contrasted this brutal reality with the pathetic lives of my family members. Right at this exact moment, Olivia was likely lounging in a plush velvet robe, complaining to a highly paid manicurist about the wrong shade of pink nail polish. Jamal was probably whining to a tailor that his custom suit jacket was slightly too tight across the shoulders. They threw dramatic tantrums over the mildest inconveniences, completely insulated by the stolen wealth they blindly believed was their birthright. I was enduring agonizing physical rehabilitation just to stand upright without assistance. The sheer disparity fueled my intense determination. I channeled every ounce of my frustration and anger directly into the grueling physical exercises. I moved from the manipulation table to the weighted sled, driving heavy iron plates across the padded floor. My legs screamed in protest, but I forced the weakened muscles to fire, to engage, and to remember how to carry the heavy burden of a grown man. Dr. Carter stood beside me, barking out numbers and demanding perfect form. He knew the specific mechanics of my combat injury. The shrapnel had severed a critical tendon requiring extensive surgical repair that left the surrounding leg structure incredibly unstable. "You have to retrain the neural pathways," Dr. Carter explained, adding another 40 pounds to the heavy metal sled. "Your brain thinks the leg is broken and useless. You have to aggressively teach your central nervous system that the structural foundation is secure. Drive from the heel, Liam." I planted my boots firmly on the rough mat and shoved the heavy weight forward. I pictured my father Richard sitting in his luxurious home office, confidently sipping his expensive scotch. He had built his entire identity on the false belief that I was weak and easily defeated. I shoved the weighted sled again, moving it across the room with aggressive, violent power. Hour after hour, I submitted myself to Dr. Carter's punishing regimen. We moved to balance drills, standing on unstable foam surfaces to force my stabilizing muscles to violently react and adapt. My ankles shook uncontrollably, but I locked my core and forced my body to remain upright. I was systematically rebuilding my physical foundation, the exact same way I was systematically preparing to dismantle my father's corporate empire. True power did not come from wearing expensive watches or leasing exotic sports cars. True power was forged in the dark, quiet moments of intense suffering when nobody else was watching to applaud your effort. By the time the grueling 3-hour session finally concluded, my shirt was completely drenched in heavy sweat, and my lungs burned for oxygen. But as I grabbed my towel and wiped my face, I realized something incredible. The chronic shooting pain that had plagued me for months had shifted into a dull, manageable ache of exhausted muscles. Dr. Carter handed me a sleek black carbon fiber brace. It was incredibly lightweight and designed to fit invisibly under a tailored suit pant leg. "Put this on," Dr. Carter instructed with a knowing nod. "You do not need that heavy wooden cane anymore. You are ready to stand on your own 2 feet and face the enemy properly." I nodded. I strapped the carbon fiber brace onto my right leg, securing the heavy Velcro straps over my scarred calf. It fit seamlessly, just as Dr. Carter promised. When I stood up and put my full weight on the injured limb, the agonizing structural weakness was gone. I took a step across the clinic floor without a limp. Then another. I was moving with the silent, deadly precision I had possessed before the shrapnel tore through my flesh. I thanked Dr. Carter with a firm handshake and walked out into the freezing morning air, feeling like a lethal weapon fully reloaded. I drove straight to the financial district, parking a few blocks away from my father's towering corporate headquarters. I was not there to see Richard. I took the private elevator up to the top floor of an adjacent glass building, stepping into the sleek minimalist offices of Attorney Mitchell. He was waiting for me in the main conference room. The massive mahogany table was covered in perfectly organized stacks of legal documents and corporate financial blueprints. Mitchell looked up from his reading glasses as I walked in, completely unassisted by my wooden cane. "An impressive physical recovery, Liam," Mitchell noted, gesturing toward an empty leather chair. "It perfectly matches our legal progress. Please sit down. We have critical final preparations to execute." I took my seat, reviewing the top document. It was a formal communication from my father's legal team, aggressively demanding a face-to-face meeting with the anonymous trustee who controlled the Horizon Plaza land deed. Richard's lawyers are operating in a state of absolute blind panic, Mitchell explained, sliding a pen across the table. Vanguard's corporate auditors have flagged the expiring ground lease as a catastrophic liability. They have issued a strict ultimatum to your father. If the lease is not officially renewed by the night of the merger, Gala Vanguard will completely withdraw their $50 million acquisition offer. Richard has instructed his team to offer highly favorable terms to the trust. He is desperate to lock this down. I picked up the pen and spun it. Did you confirm our attendance? I personally replied to his lead counsel an hour ago. Mitchell said, a sharp smile breaking his usual stoic demeanor. I informed them that the exclusive representative of the holding trust will attend the gala in person to finalize the paperwork directly with the Vanguard CEO. Richard thinks he has successfully bullied a timid old money investor out of hiding. He believes he is about to secure his ultimate financial victory right in front of his elite social circle. He is setting up his own execution stage, I replied, examining the foreclosure notices Mitchell had prepared. These documents were the killing blow. The moment I refused to sign the lease renewal, these foreclosure notices would be immediately filed, executing a total seizure of Richard's corporate assets to cover the predatory loans my grandfather had masterfully engineered. The trap was absolutely flawless. As we finalized the operational timeline, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the illuminated screen. It was a notification from the family group chat. A chat I had been silently observing for weeks without engaging. Yesterday, I had sent a brief text informing the family that I was hosting a small, simple barbecue at the farmhouse to honor what would have been Grandfather Harrison's 83rd birthday. I knew they would not attend, but I wanted to give them one final microscopic chance to show a shred of basic human decency. Instead of a polite decline, my mother Susan had sent a lengthy, deeply condescending reply aimed directly at me. I read her message aloud to Mitchell. Liam, we are far too busy dealing with actual important business to attend some little dirt farm barbecue. Your sister Olivia and Jamal are hosting a massive pre-gala celebration by our pool today with highly influential investors. We cannot have the smell of cheap smoke and rural desperation ruining our designer clothes before the biggest night of our lives. Do not bother cooking for us, and frankly, do not bother contacting us this weekend. We have 50 million reasons to celebrate, and your depressing presence is simply not welcome. Olivia quickly followed up with her own text. Seriously, Liam, stop embarrassing yourself. Nobody wants to eat burnt hot dogs in a freezing barn while you complain about your leg. Stay out of our way. The adults are securing generational wealth today. Jamal added a simple laughing emoji to the chat, solidifying their unified front of toxic arrogance. I tossed the phone onto the mahogany conference table. The absolute cruelty of their words did not hurt me anymore. It merely fueled the cold fire burning in my chest. They were so blinded by their own greed and superficial status that they could not see the massive financial guillotine hanging directly over their heads. They were actively mocking the very man holding the rope. They declined the invitation, Mitchell observed, reading the harsh messages on the glowing screen. They are thoroughly convinced their path to untouchable wealth is fully secured. They are digging their graves deeper with every single word, I said, leaning back in the heavy leather chair. They think they are dismissing a broken veteran. They have no idea they just insulted the landlord who owns the ground their entire mansion is leveraged against. Mitchell gathered the final foreclosure documents and placed them carefully inside a sleek black leather briefcase. He clicked the metallic lock shut, securing our legal ammunition. The bait is perfectly set, Liam, Mitchell said, standing up from the conference table. Richard is expecting a weak, anonymous trust manager to walk into his party and hand him the keys to a $50 million kingdom. When you walk through those grand double doors tomorrow night, his entire illusion of control will instantly shatter. I stood up, adjusting my jacket and looking out the window at my father's corporate skyscraper towering over the city skyline. By tomorrow night, that building would belong to me. My family had discarded me when I was bleeding and vulnerable. They had stolen my combat pay to fund their arrogant, lavish lives. They had spat on my grandfather's grave and mocked my physical pain. Let them enjoy their pre-gala barbecue, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. Let them drink their expensive champagne and toast to their imaginary generational wealth. Tomorrow night, I am going to crash their perfect party, and I am going to take back every single thing they stole from me. The sun dipped below the frozen horizon, casting long shadows across the empty farmhouse. I stood in the master bedroom staring at the garment bag resting on the heavy oak bed. Inside hung a bespoke charcoal gray suit, tailored to my exact measurements by the finest clothier in the city. I stripped off my casual clothes, exposing the map of violent scars that crisscrossed my torso and leg. My physical body told the brutal story of a man pushed to the absolute brink of destruction. But tonight, those scars would remain completely hidden beneath the armor of elite wealth. I pulled on the crisp white shirt, buttoning it with steady, precise movements. I stepped into the tailored trousers, the fabric draped flawlessly over the carbon fiber brace strapped securely to my right leg. There was no visible bulge, there was no indication of weakness. I slid my arms into the charcoal jacket and adjusted the collar. I walked over to the full-length mirror and studied my reflection. The man staring back was not the broken, discarded soldier who had limped out of his father's house into a blinding blizzard just weeks ago. That naive victim was dead and buried. The man in the mirror was a cold, calculating strategist. He was a multimillionaire backed by an impenetrable financial trust, holding the power to annihilate an entire corporate dynasty. I fastened a subtle silver tie clip, adjusting it with precision. I did not look like a man arriving to beg for scraps. I looked like a man arriving to collect a massive outstanding debt. I turned away from the mirror and walked over to the heavy wooden desk where my grandfather's leather briefcase rested. I opened the brass clasps and carefully inspected our legal ammunition. The finalized foreclosure notices were neatly stacked in front. The documents detailing Jamal's fraudulent transfers and my father's predatory loans sat securely in the middle. The original deed to the ground beneath Horizon Plaza rested right on top, bearing my name as the sole beneficiary of the irrevocable trust. This was not a negotiation. It was an execution order wrapped in a velvet legal glove. I snapped the briefcase shut, feeling its satisfying solid weight in my grip. During my combat deployments, my daily survival depended entirely on my rifle, my medical kit, and my situational awareness. Tonight, my survival and absolute victory depended entirely on the devastating truth contained inside this black leather case. I slipped my phone into my inner suit pocket. The family group chat remained completely silent. My parents and my sister were surrounded by makeup artists and expensive stylists, preparing to blindly walk onto their own financial execution block. I took one final look around the quiet farmhouse, drawing strength from the lingering memory of my grandfather. He had spent his final years arming me for this exact confrontation. I walked out the front door, locking it securely behind me. A sleek black town car sat idling in the snowy driveway. Mitchell had arranged for private transportation, ensuring I arrived at the venue with the exact same level of imposing prestige my father so desperately craved. The driver, a silent professional in a dark suit, opened the rear door for me. I slid into the luxurious leather interior, resting the heavy briefcase on my lap. The car glided smoothly down the rural dirt road, leaving the peaceful farm behind and accelerating toward the glowing skyline of the city. I watched the sprawling suburban neighborhoods blur past the tinted windows. We drove past the affluent gated community where my parents lived. The massive iron gates and towering brick walls looked incredibly small to me now. They were nothing but a fragile facade hiding a rotting foundation of debt and manipulation. As we entered the downtown financial district, the traffic thickened with luxury vehicles all funneling toward the same destination. The towering glass structure of Horizon Plaza dominated the city block, serving as a glowing monument to my father's massive ego. He had built that shimmering skyscraper using my blood money, and tonight I was going to rip it right out of his greedy hands. The town car smoothly pulled up to the grand entrance of the elite downtown event center. The street was lined with aggressive paparazzi and wealthy socialites eager to be photographed at the corporate merger of the decade. Flashing camera lights illuminated the freezing winter air. Security guards frantically managed the velvet ropes separating the invited elite from the desperate onlookers. The driver opened my door. I stepped onto the pavement, planting my braced leg firmly on the concrete. I felt absolutely zero pain. I felt only pure, cold adrenaline. I gripped the leather briefcase and walked confidently toward the massive entrance. I moved with a fluid, predatory grace that completely defied my previous medical charts. The heavy wooden cane was gone. The pathetic limp was entirely erased. I bypassed the crowded line of minor executives and approached the primary security checkpoint reserved exclusively for major stakeholders and VIP guests. A tall security guard held up his hand requesting my credentials. I did not say a single word. I reached into my pocket and handed him the gold foil invitation Mitchell had secured. The guard scanned the exclusive credential and immediately stepped aside, opening the thick velvet rope. He gave me a respectful nod, assuming I was just another wealthy tech investor or a silent partner from the Vanguard Group. He had absolutely no idea he was letting the Grim Reaper into the party. I stepped through the grand double doors and entered the chaotic, glittering epicenter of my family's illusion. The air inside smelled of expensive perfume, rich food, and desperate ambition. Soft classical music played over the low hum of hundreds of overlapping, arrogant conversations. I stood at the edge of the massive ballroom, scanning the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns, easily tracking my targets. The trap was locked, and the hunt had officially begun. The glittering ballroom was a masterclass in aggressive financial vanity. Massive ice sculptures depicting soaring skyscrapers dominated the buffet tables, weeping frozen tears onto silver platters of caviar. Waiters in stark white tuxedos glided flawlessly through the crowd, carrying trays of vintage champagne. Every element of this celebration had been engineered by my mother to project an aura of absolute invincibility. I stood silently near a towering pillar wrapped in white silk, letting the chaotic noise wash over me. I simply observed, tracing the lines of power and desperation hidden beneath the expensive perfume and forced laughter. My military background hardwired my brain to constantly assess environments for hostile targets. I quickly located my father holding court near the room center. Richard stood perfectly erect, a smug, triumphant grin plastered across his heavily manicured face. He aggressively shook hands with prominent city officials, clapping them on the shoulder with the unearned confidence of a billionaire. He looked relaxed, entirely convinced his house of cards was permanently cemented to the ground. He had no idea his corporate foundation was legally disintegrating beneath his polished Italian leather shoes. Just a few yards away, my mother Susan held an elite group of wealthy socialites hostage with loud, boastful stories. She wore a sparkling emerald gown that clung tightly to her frame, her neck heavy with diamonds I had unknowingly purchased with my combat pay. She dismissed a passing waiter with a cruel flick of her wrist, snatching a champagne flute without looking. She radiated toxic superiority, fully believing she had finally cemented her rightful place at the absolute pinnacle of the city elite. Over by the custom cocktail bar, Olivia and Jamal engaged in their own grotesque display of wealth. Jamal spoke loudly to a circle of younger investment bankers, making sweeping, arrogant gestures. His custom silk suit caught the light perfectly as he boasted about securing massive returns. His exclusive clients had no clue his fund was completely hollow, heavily leveraged against my father's dying company. Olivia hung tightly onto his arm, tossing her head back in exaggerated laughter. She was oblivious to the massive foreclosures locked inside my briefcase. I moved slowly through the dense crowd, testing the carbon fiber brace hidden beneath my tailored trousers. I navigated the sea of oblivious elites with silent precision. Guests caught my cold, calculating stare, but their eyes quickly slid past. I was a ghost crashing an execution. I secured a glass of sparkling water and positioned myself strategically near the front edge of the main stage. The stage was flanked by digital screens displaying the logos of my father's real estate company, interlocking with Vanguard Group. Conversations buzzed excitedly around me, entirely focused on the historic financial merger. I listened to rival developers whisper about Richard's sudden massive success, wondering how he managed to pull off such an incredibly lucrative deal. They debated his brilliant business strategies, completely unaware his entire empire was built on stolen military wages and desperate high-interest loans. The sheer irony of the situation tasted sweeter than any expensive wine. Suddenly, the bright overhead chandeliers dimmed, casting the vast ballroom into dramatic shadows. A powerful spotlight illuminated the center of the main stage. The loud murmurs of the crowd instantly dropped to a hushed, respectful silence. A tall, imposing man with striking silver hair and a sharp, tailored suit confidently climbed the short steps to the podium. This was CEO Maxwell, the ruthless head of the Vanguard Group. He was known throughout the financial sector for completely destroying companies that failed to deliver on their contractual promises. Richard stepped forward, standing proudly at the absolute edge of the stage right below the podium. He puffed out his chest, looking around the darkened room to ensure every single camera was properly focused on his moment of supreme triumph. Susan, Olivia, and Jamal pushed their way to the front, standing directly behind Richard, their faces glowing with unrestrained greed. CEO Maxwell adjusted the microphone. The sharp screech of feedback silenced any remaining whispers in the massive hall. "Good evening, distinguished guests," Maxwell began, his deep voice echoing powerfully across the room. "Tonight we are gathered to celebrate a monumental achievement in commercial real estate. We are here to officially recognize the seamless integration of two corporate entities. The Vanguard Group is incredibly proud to announce our $50 million acquisition of the Horizon Plaza portfolio." The crowd erupted into polite but enthusiastic applause. Richard beamed, soaking in the immense validation he had craved his entire pathetic life. He waved graciously to his wealthy peers, pretending to be humbled by the overwhelming attention. Maxwell raised his hands, calling for silence. "As many of you know, a merger of this magnitude requires meticulous legal perfection. We have thoroughly audited the Horizon Plaza development. The buildings are magnificent. The location is flawless. There is, however, one final critical administrative step required before we can permanently finalize this historic contract tonight." The CEO smiled, looking directly down at Richard. "Horizon Plaza sits on incredibly valuable commercial dirt. The current ground lease expires in exactly 1 month. Vanguard absolutely will not finalize any $50 million acquisition without a permanent guarantee of land security. The entire foundation of this corporate merger relies exclusively on the renewal of that specific lease." The ballroom remained completely silent. The heavy tension in the air was absolutely suffocating. "Fortunately," Maxwell continued, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "the anonymous holding trust that owns the Horizon Plaza land deed has graciously agreed to reveal themselves tonight. The exclusive representative of that trust is currently in this room to sign the lease renewal live on this stage." My grip tightened around the thick handle of my black leather briefcase, filled with their ultimate doom. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm, completely devoid of any fear or hesitation. The grueling years of betrayal and quiet preparation had culminated right here. The time for waiting in the shadows was permanently over. I stepped away from the silk-wrapped pillar, letting the ambient light catch the sharp lines of my charcoal suit. The crowd was dense, but I moved with deliberate purpose, heading directly toward the illuminated front stage. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, confident stride of a man who owned the very floor beneath his feet. My eyes remained locked on the podium, where CEO Maxwell stood patiently waiting for his anonymous savior. As I navigated past a lavish champagne tower, my path intersected with the exact two people I had hoped to encounter first. Olivia and Jamal were making their way back from the custom cocktail bar, laughing loudly about some private joke. Olivia spotted me first. Her perfectly rehearsed smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She grabbed Jamal by the arm, spilling a generous splash of his expensive bourbon onto the polished marble floor. Jamal snapped his head around, his dark eyes widening in disbelief as he registered my presence. They immediately abandoned their drinks on a passing waiter's tray and aggressively moved to intercept me before I could get any closer to the stage. "What the hell are you doing here?" Olivia hissed. Her voice was a venomous whisper designed to avoid drawing attention from the surrounding elite guests. She looked me up and down, her eyes raking over my tailored suit with absolute disdain. She clearly assumed I had rented it or bought it from a cheap discount store, because in her mind, I was entirely incapable of affording quality. Did you seriously crash the most important night of our lives just to beg for a handout? You are pathetic, Liam. Security is going to drag you out of here by your bad leg. Jamal stepped directly into my personal space, attempting to use his height to physically intimidate me. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his silk lapels with a smug sense of superiority. Look at this broken veteran trying to play dress-up. Jamal sneered, his tone dripping with toxic arrogance. I told you to stay on that freezing dirt farm, man. This room is for actual players. We are dealing with $50 million tonight. You do not even have enough money to pay for a cheap cab ride home. Turn around right now and limp back out the front door before I personally throw you onto the street. I stopped walking, but I did not step back. I stood my ground, clutching the heavy handle of my leather briefcase. I looked at their angry, panicked faces and felt absolutely nothing but cold satisfaction. I wanted them to exhaust all their ammunition. I wanted them to put their bloated egos on full display right before the fall. In combat, you let the enemy expend their heavy artillery against a fortified bunker before you reveal your true position. I am not here for a handout, Jamal. I said, my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly steady. I am here because I have very specific business to conduct tonight. Olivia let out a sharp, cruel laugh, tossing her perfectly styled hair. Business? What business could a crippled dropout possibly have at a billionaire merger gala? Are you going to ask the Vanguard CEO if he needs his lawn mowed? You are a delusional embarrassment, Liam. You have always been a massive burden, and coming here tonight just proves how desperate you really are. Before I could respond, a flash of emerald green caught my peripheral vision. My mother, Susan, had spotted the confrontation from her circle of wealthy socialites. She practically sprinted across the ballroom floor, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the marble. She shoved her way past a group of tech investors and grabbed Olivia by the shoulder, her face pale with suppressed panic. "What is he doing here?" Susan demanded, glaring at me as if I were a diseased animal that had wandered into her pristine home. "Liam, I swear to God, if you ruin this night for your father, I will personally ensure you are locked away in a psychiatric ward. We are 5 minutes away from securing generational wealth. You have absolutely no right to be standing in this room." "I have every right to be here, Susan," I replied, refusing to call her mother. "In fact, this entire celebration cannot proceed without my direct participation." Jamal let out a loud mocking bark of laughter, shaking his head in disbelief. Listen to this guy. He actually believes his own psychotic delusions. He thinks he is a player. Susan, go signal the guards by the entrance. We need this trash removed quietly before Richard sees him. "You do not need to call security," I stated, shifting my weight effortlessly on my carbon fiber brace. "I am holding an official invitation. I am here to meet with Mr. Maxwell." My mother sneered, leaning in close so I could smell the sharp scent of her expensive perfume. "Mr. Maxwell is the CEO of the Vanguard Group. He destroys companies for sport. He does not waste his breath on discarded military failures. You are nothing to him, Liam. You are nothing to anyone in this building. Get out of my sight before I make a scene." I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic words wash over me. For 10 years, I had internalized their constant rejection. I had believed their narrative that I was somehow less valuable because I chose service over greed. But looking at them now, I only saw weak, fragile people clinging desperately to a sinking ship. They were entirely dependent on the illusion of wealth, while I held the absolute concrete power to sink them. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they could not sense the fatal trap closing around their throats. Suddenly, the crowd parted slightly, and my father Richard stormed into our small circle. His face was flushed crimson red with violent rage. He had stepped down from the edge of the stage while Maxwell was pausing for a photo opportunity. Richard grabbed me by the arm, his fingers digging painfully into my bicep. "You ungrateful, worthless parasite!" Richard snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I told you to rot on that farm. You are intentionally trying to sabotage my $50 million deal out of pure spite. I will destroy you for this, Liam. I will bury you so deep you will wish you died in the desert. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I did not flinch. I slowly, deliberately raised my eyes to meet his furious gaze. I let a cold, predatory smile touch the corners of my mouth. I raised my left hand and firmly tapped the thick leather of the briefcase holding his complete financial execution. You cannot destroy a man who holds the keys to your entire kingdom, Richard, I said softly, ensuring only the four of them could hear my words. I suggest you let go of my arm and step back to the stage. Your VIP guest is waiting for me. Richard froze, his eyes darting from my calm face to the heavy black briefcase. Confusion flashed across his features, battling with his overwhelming arrogance. The ultimate confrontation had finally ignited, and I was ready to burn their empire to the ground. Richard slowly released his grip on my arm. He pulled his hand back as if touching my tailored suit had somehow burned him. The brief flash of confusion on his face was instantly swallowed by his monumental ego. He scoffed, shaking his head with pure pity. He believed my warning was nothing more than the pathetic rambling of a broken man trying to steal his spotlight. He leaned in close. He whispered a final threat, promising to ruin my life the second this merger was complete. Then he turned his back on me and strode confidently toward the brilliantly lit stage. I remained perfectly still, watching him walk away. Susan, Olivia, and Jamal shot me glares of absolute disgust before hurriedly following Richard to reclaim their positions near the podium. They were ready for their coronation. On the stage, CEO Maxwell stood behind the clear acrylic podium. He gripped the edges of the stand, projecting ultimate authority. Behind him, the digital screens shifted to an aerial video of Horizon Plaza. It looked like an unstoppable empire. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maxwell's voice boomed through the sound system, commanding attention from every elite guest. "What you see on the screens is not merely a collection of steel and glass. It is the future of the financial district. It represents visionary development. Richard has constructed a magnificent commercial hub. At Vanguard, we do not invest in mere aesthetics. We invest in concrete, unshakable security." The crowd murmured in agreement. Richard stood tall at the edge of the stage, nodding along with Maxwell's every word. He placed his hands on his hips. He looked entirely victorious. In his mind, he was already spending the $50 million. He viewed the signing as a mere formality before the celebration could begin. In the world of commercial real estate, the buildings are only as valuable as the ground they stand upon, Maxwell continued. You can build a fortress of solid gold, but if you do not control the dirt beneath it, you control absolutely nothing. Horizon Plaza sits on coveted real estate. The current ground lease is entering its final 30 days. Without a guaranteed long-term renewal, this magnificent complex is a catastrophic liability. Vanguard demands absolute control before we authorize a $50 million acquisition. Maxwell paused for dramatic effect. An executive assistant in a sharp suit walked onto the stage carrying a polished silver tray. Resting on the tray was a thick legal binder bound in premium dark leather. It was the master lease agreement. The document held the power to either finalize the merger or trigger a fatal collapse. The assistant placed the binder on a small wooden table next to the podium and stepped back into the shadows. Richard practically salivated, staring at the leather binder. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. It was a custom-engraved gift Susan had bought him to celebrate the merger. He rolled the pen between his fingers, his eyes gleaming with greed. He glanced quickly toward the back of the room, shooting me a mocking, triumphant smirk. He wanted me to witness the exact second he officially became a titan of industry. I stared right back at him, my face an unreadable mask of stone. I held my black briefcase firmly in my left hand, feeling the crisp edges of the foreclosure documents pressing against the leather. He was celebrating a contract that he would never be allowed to sign. He was holding a golden pen to authorize his own financial execution. We have spent weeks engaged in rigorous negotiations with the legal representatives of the holding trust that owns this land, Maxwell announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. They are notoriously private, maintaining absolute anonymity throughout the entire process. They demanded strict confidentiality, holding all the leverage in our discussions. But we have successfully reached an agreement that satisfies the demands of the Vanguard Group. The trust has agreed to grant a 99-year lease renewal, securing the foundation of Horizon Plaza and allowing this historic merger to proceed immediately. A wave of excited applause rippled through the audience. Flashbulbs erupted, capturing Richard's ecstatic reaction. Olivia bounced slightly, clapping her hands with unrestrained glee. Jamal checked his designer watch, calculating how fast he could wire funds to cover his fraudulent tracks once the deal closed. Susan dabbed at her dry eyes, pretending to be overwhelmed by the beautiful success of her husband. This historic moment requires the presence of all primary stakeholders, Maxwell declared, raising his hand to silence the applause. Richard, please join me here at the signing table. Richard eagerly climbed the short steps to the stage, his polished shoes gleaming under the spotlight. He approached the table with the swagger of a conquering king. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and positioned himself next to the leather binder, ready to claim his prize. He looked out over the sea of wealthy faces. And now, Maxwell said, turning toward the audience with a welcoming gesture, we must finalize the foundation. I have been informed that the exclusive representative of the Anonymous Holding Trust, the legal owner of the Horizon Plaza land deed, is currently present in this ballroom. We ask that you please step forward, join us on the stage, and sign this binding agreement to officially launch our new partnership. The entire massive ballroom silently held its collective breath. Hundreds of elite guests craned their necks, looking around the lavish space to see which wealthy tycoon or reclusive billionaire would step out from the shadows. Richard stood by the table, his golden pen poised in the air, a broad, welcoming smile fixed on his face. He was completely and utterly ready to graciously greet his anonymous savior. He was completely unaware that the man stepping out of the shadows was carrying a death warrant instead of a salvation. I took a deep breath, feeling the solid support of my carbon fiber brace. I tightened my grip on the briefcase and took my first slow, deliberate step forward, moving directly toward the brilliantly illuminated stage. The crowd parted before me like a massive wave. As I moved closer to the stage, the hushed whispers of anticipation transformed into mutters of confusion. Wealthy investors and elite socialites pointed their fingers. They recognized me as the man standing quietly in the shadows, observing them all night. They did not see a powerful real estate mogul. They saw a man walking with a slow, methodical gait, carrying a battered black leather briefcase. Jamal noticed my forward movement first. He nudged Olivia and aggressively pointed his finger in my direction. Olivia gasped out loud, quickly covering her mouth with her trembling hand. Her eyes widened with absolute fury. She frantically tapped my mother on the shoulder. Susan whipped her head around, and her elegant expression instantly contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. Up on the lit stage, Richard was still scanning the back of the massive room, completely oblivious to my approach until I reached the first carpeted step. He looked down, and his triumphant smile instantly shattered into a million pieces. His face flushed a dangerous purple. He leaned over the acrylic edge of the stage, his voice a harsh, frantic hiss meant exclusively for me. What the hell are you doing, you absolute lunatic? I told you to stay out of my way. Security. Someone get security over here right now before he ruins everything. I ignored his aggressive, panicked commands and firmly placed my boot on the first step. Two burly security guards in dark tactical suits immediately materialized from the side wings, rushing forward to physically intercept me. They reached out to grab my shoulders, but a sharp, highly authoritative voice echoed forcefully through the entire ballroom, stopping them dead in their tracks. Do not touch him. Stand down immediately. Attorney Mitchell stepped out from the front row of the VIP audience. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket with practiced efficiency and walked briskly up the short stairs, completely bypassing the stunned security guards. Mitchell approached the clear acrylic podium and stood directly next to a bewildered CEO Maxwell. Maxwell frowned deeply, his silver eyebrows drawing together in strict corporate confusion. Excuse me, sir. This private stage is exclusively reserved for the lease signing. We are actively waiting for the representative of the holding trust. Mitchell reached into his tailored interior pocket and produced a thick, sealed envelope. He handed it smoothly to the Vanguard CEO. My name is Attorney Mitchell. I am the senior managing partner at Mitchell & Associates. That specific envelope contains my certified credentials and legal authorization. I am the sole legal counsel representing the irrevocable trust that maintains absolute ownership of the land beneath Horizon Plaza. Maxwell quickly tore open the heavy envelope and meticulously scanned the watermarked legal documents inside. His aggressive, impatient demeanor immediately shifted into a posture of high-level corporate respect. He nodded firmly, extending his hand to shake Mitchell's right there on the stage. Mr. Mitchell, Vanguard has been eagerly waiting for your arrival all night. Please, the floor is yours. Richard stood frozen by the wooden signing table, his custom golden pen hovering uselessly in the cold air. He looked at Mitchell with wide eyes, then glared maliciously down at me, still standing calmly on the stairs. He clearly believed Mitchell was about to have me forcibly and publicly removed. Mr. Mitchell, Richard said, forcing a charming, desperate smile onto his sweating face. Thank God you are here to handle this embarrassing situation. Please excuse this minor disruption. My estranged son has a tragic history of severe mental instability following his military service. He is clearly having a psychological episode. I will have him escorted out immediately so we can finalize our highly profitable business. Susan rushed to the bottom of the stage stairs, grabbing my suit sleeve with her sharp, manicured claws. Liam, stop humiliating us in front of these billionaires. Get out of here right now before I call the police. I smoothly pulled my arm away from her toxic grip. I took the final upward step and walked directly onto the exact center of the stage. Mitchell deliberately adjusted the microphone, pulling it closer to his mouth. The massive ballroom was so incredibly silent, you could actually hear the giant ice sculptures dripping slowly onto their silver collection trays. There seems to be a profound and catastrophic misunderstanding regarding the ownership structure of this commercial real estate, Mitchell announced over the speakers. His voice was cold, precise, and utterly merciless. The holding trust that owns the highly coveted dirt beneath this skyscraper is an entirely private, protected entity. It was established exactly 8 years ago with a singular, strict legal mandate. The assets secured inside cannot be sold, altered, or transferred without the direct written authorization of its sole beneficiary. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his panicked eyes darting back and forth between Mitchell and the imposing Vanguard CEO. Yes, we fully understand the complex legalities, Mr. Mitchell. I have readily agreed to all the financial terms requested by your client. We are completely prepared to sign the 99-year renewal right here, right now. Mitchell looked at Richard with a devastating gaze that could freeze boiling water. You cannot sign a binding contract with an entity that absolutely refuses to do business with you, Richard. My law firm does not make executive financial decisions for the trust. We merely execute the strict operational orders of the legal landowner. Mitchell turned away from the trembling real estate developer and gestured directly toward me. Ladies and gentlemen of the Vanguard Group and distinguished guests, Mitchell proclaimed loudly, please allow me to formally introduce my client. He is the sole controlling beneficiary of the irrevocable trust and the absolute legal owner of the Horizon Plaza property deed, Mr. Liam. The heavy silence in the ballroom violently shattered. A massive collective gasp echoed sharply off the high vaulted ceilings. Hundreds of camera flashes exploded simultaneously like heavy artillery fire, completely blinding the elite front row. Behind me, the distinct sound of breaking glass pierced the chaotic noise. I turned my head slightly. Susan had dropped her expensive crystal champagne flute. It shattered into 100 jagged pieces on the polished marble floor. Her mouth hung open in an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Olivia staggered backward violently, bumping into Jamal, who looked as if he had just been struck forcefully in the chest by a high-speed train. Richard physically stumbled. He actually took a terrified step back, away from the wooden signing table, his arrogant face draining of all natural color. He looked from the useless golden pen in his trembling hand to my calm, unreadable face. This is a sick joke, Richard stammered, his dry voice cracking loudly over the open microphone. This is a forged, pathetic stunt. He is a broke, unemployed veteran. He does not have a single dime to his name. I walked directly over to the wooden signing table. I placed my heavy black leather briefcase right next to the master lease agreement. I popped the brass clasps. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the stage microphones, perfectly amplifying the inevitable sound of my father's total destruction. I reached inside and pulled out the original property deed bearing the official heavily embossed county seals. I dropped it firmly onto the table right in front of CEO Maxwell. Maxwell picked up the thick document, his sharp eyes rapidly scanning the authentic legal seals and the bold printed name indicating my absolute ownership. He looked up at me and nodded slowly, confirming the fatal, undisputed truth. I turned to face my father. He was shaking violently, his perfect, arrogant posture completely collapsing in on itself. He finally realized the massive magnitude of the fatal trap he had blindly walked right into. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Richard," I said, my voice carrying a lethal military calm that completely silenced the entire chaotic room. "I do not have a single dime of my military pay, because for 10 brutal years you shamelessly stole every last cent of it to aggressively fund your pathetic illusions of elite grandeur. But my grandfather knew exactly what you were doing, and he used your own massive unhinged theft to permanently build my kingdom right underneath your feet." Richard staggered backward as if I had driven a physical blade directly through his ribs. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving behind a sickly pale mask of absolute terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic strangled gasp escaped his throat. The towering titan of real estate had been instantly reduced to a trembling, cornered animal. I did not give him a single second to recover his composure. I turned my attention away from my hyperventilating father and focused entirely on the imposing figure of CEO Maxwell. "Mr. Maxwell," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the open stage microphones. "You stated earlier that Vanguard requires absolute structural security before authorizing a $50 million acquisition. I am here to formally inform you that the corporate structure of Horizon Plaza is entirely hollow. It is a massive financial illusion built on predatory debt and criminal fraud." A sharp collective murmur ripped through the elite crowd. Investors and city officials exchanged alarmed glances, rapidly whispering to one another. Jamal tried to push his way toward the stage steps, shouting that I was a deranged liar. But Attorney Mitchell smoothly signaled the Vanguard security detail. 2 massive guards immediately blocked Jamal, firmly forcing him back into the stunned audience. I reached into my black leather briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of forensic accounting records my grandfather had meticulously prepared. I dropped the heavy files directly onto the wooden signing table, pushing them toward Maxwell. "My father Richard did not build this empire through brilliant market strategy," I announced to the silent ballroom. "He built it by systematically stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from my military combat pay while I was deployed overseas. But that theft was merely the beginning of his fatal mistakes. He drained my accounts to secretly bail out his son-in-law Jamal, who is currently running a massive illegal Ponzi scheme disguised as a boutique investment fund." Jamal let out a loud, desperate shout of denial from the floor, but his voice cracked with obvious panic. Several wealthy clients who had invested in Jamal's fund immediately turned on him, their faces twisted into expressions of pure fury. They grabbed him by the lapels of his custom silk suit, aggressively demanding to know where their money was. I kept my eyes locked on Maxwell, who was now rapidly flipping through the certified bank statements and forensic audits I had provided. His silver eyebrows drew together in a tight, severe line. When the stolen military funds ran out, I continued ensuring every single microphone caught my words. Richard secretly leveraged his entire development company to secure desperate high-interest corporate loans. He used that highly predatory bank money to fund my sister Olivia's lavish lifestyle and to artificially inflate his own corporate ledgers to trick Vanguard into this merger. Every single luxury car, every mansion, every designer watch my family currently owns is directly tied to those toxic corporate loans. They are completely drowning in massive, unrecoverable debt. Richard violently lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the acrylic podium. Do not listen to him, Maxwell. He is a traumatized veteran having a severe psychotic break. My company is completely solid. The Horizon Plaza development generates millions in steady revenue. We are highly profitable. I pulled the final set of documents from my briefcase. They were the formalized legal foreclosure notices. Your company generated revenue only because you possessed a valid ground lease. I stated, holding the foreclosure notices up for the media cameras to capture. As the sole legal owner of the land beneath Horizon Plaza, I am officially announcing that the holding trust absolutely refuses to renew your lease agreement. Your access to the property is permanently terminated effective immediately. Richard let out a visceral, agonizing scream. You cannot do this. We are family, Liam. You will destroy everything I have ever built. You destroyed yourself, Richard, I replied, my voice dropping to a lethal calm. The moment this lease expires tonight, your banks will aggressively call in those massive predatory loans. Since you no longer have a building to generate revenue, your company will instantly default. The financial shockwave will automatically trigger the immediate repossession of every single asset tied to your name. CEO. Maxwell closed the forensic accounting file with a sharp, decisive snap. His face was a mask of cold corporate fury. Vanguard was an elite institution that thrived on immaculate public reputation and ironclad financial stability. The mere suggestion of acquiring a deeply fraudulent company tied to stolen military wages and a failing Ponzi scheme was a catastrophic public relations nightmare. Maxwell did not become a billionaire by taking unnecessary emotional risks. He was a ruthless pragmatist. Maxwell turned slowly toward Richard. The absolute contempt in the CEO's eyes was absolutely devastating. Richard Maxwell said, his deep voice completely devoid of any previous warmth. The Vanguard Group operates with strict adherence to legal and financial transparency. You deliberately falsified your corporate valuation. You attempted to sell us a hollow, heavily leveraged shell of a company. You severely jeopardized my firm's immaculate reputation by dragging us into a criminal fraud investigation. Maxwell, please, Richard begged, dropping to his knees on the carpeted stage. He reached out, grabbing the hem of the CEO's tailored suit jacket. I can fix this. I can secure new funding. Just sign the merger paperwork. I just need the $50 million to clear the ledgers. Maxwell forcefully yanked his suit jacket out of Richard's desperate grip. He stepped back, looking down at my father with absolute disgust. There will be no $50 million acquisition, Maxwell declared, his voice echoing like a judge delivering a fatal sentence. The Vanguard Group officially and permanently withdraws all offers of merger and acquisition regarding Horizon Plaza. Our legal team will be filing a massive civil lawsuit against your firm tomorrow morning for extreme corporate fraud and breach of faith. This $50 million deal is entirely dead. The ballroom air, once thick with the scent of expensive perfume and triumph, now reeked of panic and sour sweat. The absolute silence that followed Maxwell's declaration was broken only by the rapid-fire shutter sounds of news cameras. Reporters had stopped pretending to be guests. They were now vultures circling a fresh kill. My father remained on his knees, his expensive tuxedo jacket bunched up around his shoulders, staring blankly at the empty space where a $50 million future had just vanished. Susan stood behind him, her hands trembling so violently that the diamonds on her fingers clicked against one another in a frantic, discordant rhythm. Olivia had stopped crying. She was now locked in a state of catatonic shock, her designer dress looking like a funeral shroud for her lost social standing. The security team from the Vanguard Group began clearing the stage. They moved with the cold, efficient detachment of men used to dealing with corporate catastrophes. One of the guards grabbed Richard by the elbows, lifting him to his feet with zero respect for his former status. My father didn't fight back. He looked like a man who had suddenly lost the ability to comprehend his own reality. He stumbled toward the side exit, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Susan scrambled to follow him, her fur coat dragging across the stage floor. She tried to whisper something to the board members as she passed, but they pointedly turned their backs, their faces hard with the sudden sharp realization that the Hendersons were radioactive. Jamal was having his own spectacular collapse in the middle of the ballroom floor. The investors he had been charming just 20 minutes ago had formed a tight, aggressive circle around him. A tech entrepreneur named David, who I knew had invested at least $2 million in Jamal's fund, held a phone out to Jamal's face. "The accounts are empty, Jamal. Every single dashboard is showing a zero balance. Where is the money?" David's voice was loud enough to be heard over the frantic buzz of the room. Jamal's face was no longer red with anger. It was the translucent gray of a man watching his life ending. "It's a temporary glitch," Jamal stammered, his polished corporate facade completely disintegrated. "It's the bank's internal system update. Everything is fine. Just give me 24 hours. The lie was so transparent, so pathetic, that a group of onlookers actually laughed. It wasn't polite laughter. It was the sharp, jagged sound of people watching a con artist lose his footing. Jamal reached out to grab a glass of wine from a passing waiter, but his hand shook so badly, he knocked the tray over instead. The shattering crystals signaled the final end of his masquerade. The Vanguard CEO Maxwell was already on his mobile device, his tone commanding and lethal. "Initiate the full audit of all Henderson-linked entities immediately. Notify the SEC. Freeze every secondary account connected to the Horizon Plaza development portfolio. If there is a single cent of Vanguard capital mingled with these fraudulent assets, I want it located and seized before morning." I watched the Vanguard legal team descend upon the room like a swarm of locusts. They were handing out subpoenas to my father's former associates, freezing secondary bank accounts and cordoning off the signing table as if it were a crime scene. My father's corporate reputation, built over 30 years of cutthroat deals and strategic lies, was being shredded in less than an hour. The elite guests who had come to witness a merger were now witnessing a public execution. They pulled their own reputations away from the Henderson name as if it were a contagious disease. I took a slow sip of my water, leaning comfortably against the edge of the stage. The view was perfect. I saw my mother try to approach the CEO of a rival firm, her hand extended in a desperate plea for a moment of his time. He didn't even acknowledge her existence, turning his back to chat with someone else. The sheer, cold reality of social Darwinism was playing out before me. My family had spent years using people discarding the burdens and inflating their status. Now the vacuum of their own character had finally sucked them into the void. "Look at them," Mitchell said, stepping up to stand beside me. "The pride they wore like armor has become the weight that is drowning them." He was right. Richard, once the king of the room, was being ushered toward the parking garage by hotel security. His expensive suit rumpled, his hair disheveled, his dignity entirely absent. He looked back one last time at the ballroom, his eyes searching the crowd, not for sympathy, but for a scapegoat. When he locked eyes with me, he didn't see a son. He saw the architect of his demise. He mouthed something that looked like a curse, but the security guards were already pushing him through the heavy brass doors. Jamal was finally tackled by the anger of his investors. He was escorted out by the local police, his hands cuffed behind his back, his designer suit jacket ruined by someone's shove. Olivia had collapsed onto a nearby velvet bench, her head in her hands, her phone buzzing incessantly as notifications from angry creditors poured in. She had no idea that her access to the family bank accounts had already been terminated. The ballroom slowly emptied. The guests didn't want to be caught in the fallout. They filed out, casting sidelong glances at the wreckage of the Henderson legacy. I set my empty glass on the table where the death warrant had been signed. I hadn't raised a finger, hadn't shouted a single insult. I simply revealed the truth and stood back to watch the inevitable physics of greed destroy them. My work here was finished. The Horizon Plaza lease was dead, the merger was incinerated, and the Henderson family was facing a total collapse that would leave them with nothing but the truth they had tried so hard to bury. I turned and walked toward the exit, my carbon fiber brace moving silently beneath my tailored trousers. I was leaving the ballroom, but for the first time, I was truly stepping into the world free of the baggage, the lies, and the shadows of a family that had never been a family at all. I walked into the crisp, cold night air, the streetlights reflecting on my face as I looked toward the future. They had discarded me in the snow, thinking I would never rise again. They never considered that the cold had only made me stronger. The week following the gala was a masterclass in the disintegration of a high-status reputation. The local headlines no longer focused on corporate synergy or real estate dominance. They were entirely consumed by the Henderson family collapse. Every morning I woke up in my quiet apartment to the hum of the city reading the latest reports on the federal investigation. Richard, once the untouchable titan of downtown development, was now a regular visitor at the federal prosecutor's office. The audit conducted by Vanguard had unearthed a mountain of evidence. It wasn't just the stolen money from my military accounts. It was a decade of sophisticated tax evasion, illegal kickbacks to city officials, and the systematic falsification of corporate earnings. The federal investigators weren't just looking for money anymore. They were building a massive criminal case that threatened to put my father behind bars for a significant portion of his remaining life. Richard's former legal team, the expensive sharks he had relied on to keep his empire afloat, had abandoned him the moment the first subpoena was served. They knew a losing battle when they saw one, and there was no way to defend against the irrefutable paper trail of corruption I had handed them. He was forced to hire a court-appointed public defender, a humiliating reality check for a man who used to brag about paying millions in annual legal retainers. His image, the hard-working, self-made billionaire, was rapidly being replaced by the portrait of a desperate, cornered criminal. He became a social pariah overnight. The country clubs, the charity boards, and the private dinners where he had spent decades curating his influence now treated his name like a toxic plague. People he had called his closest confidants wouldn't even return his phone calls, fearing the investigative fallout that would inevitably touch anyone connected to him. Olivia suffered a similarly swift and brutal erasure from the life she had cultivated. The bankruptcy filings were not just a minor setback, they were a total scorched earth event. Because her personal assets were inextricably linked to the predatory loans Richard had taken out, the bank didn't just repossess the luxury cars and the jewelry, they systematically stripped everything. She was forced to vacate her waterfront property within 72 hours of the initial default. Social media, which had once been her playground for flaunting wealth, turned into a digital hunting ground. Her former followers, the people who had envied her lavish lifestyle, now flooded her comments with scathing ridicule. They posted screenshots of her old luxury hauls, next to news articles about her father's impending prison sentence. The digital humiliation was absolute. She retreated into her tiny rented apartment in the outskirts of the city, attempting to maintain her social standing by posting photos that tried to appear wealthy despite her empty accounts. It was a pathetic performance that only served to invite more mockery. Jamal, her husband, had disappeared shortly after the gala. He wasn't there to support her through the bankruptcy. He was too busy trying to hide his own trail of illicit investments from the authorities. Olivia was left completely alone to face the consequences of a life built entirely on borrowed capital and fragile pretenses. She reached out to me twice in those first 3 weeks, her voice small and tremulous, asking if there was any way I could use my influence to clear up the misunderstanding. I didn't even respond. I had no energy to waste on her attempts to rewrite history now that the bill had finally come due. Susan, my mother, was perhaps the most isolated of them all. She had identified herself entirely through her position as the matriarch of the Henderson Empire. Without the country club galas, the charity luncheons, and the prestige of her husband's career, she was stripped of her only source of identity. She spent her days shuttered inside the remnants of their household, unable to face the neighbors who watched the moving trucks dismantle their life. Her friends, the same women she had lorded her status over for years, were nowhere to be found. They had all moved on, distancing themselves from the scandal before the federal investigation could widen its net to include their own social circle. My mother became a recluse, haunted by the sudden collapse of her carefully curated reality. I watched the family circle shrink until it was nothing. They were collectively suffering from the exact social isolation they had inflicted on me for years. Only theirs was driven by public disgrace rather than quiet rejection. It was a cold, objective justice. I took no active role in their suffering. I didn't need to. The mechanism of their own greed had performed the work for me. They had spent their entire lives treating people as assets to be exploited, and when those assets, the money, the reputation, the perceived success evaporated, they were left with nothing. They had no genuine friends because they had never invested in genuine relationships. They had no support network because they had consistently burned every bridge they crossed to build their own ego. I returned to my work focusing on the future I was constructing. The foundation I had established was gaining momentum. We were receiving letters of support from all over the country, not because of the drama, but because the mission of helping veterans and their families resonated with people who valued actual integrity. Every time I looked at the bank statement for the trust or reviewed the legal filings that kept my family's toxic influence at bay, I felt a deep, grounded calm. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I had taken the wreckage of my life, the shattered leg, the stolen savings, the betrayal, and used it as the foundation for a life that was finally unequivocally my own. The fallout of their actions wasn't my responsibility to mitigate. I was the observer of a collapse that they had initiated, fueled, and finalized entirely on their own terms. The house of cards hadn't just fallen, it had disintegrated, leaving no trace of the structure that had once made me feel so incredibly small. The federal prosecution of my father and the resulting bankruptcy of my sister's household were necessary steps in cleaning up the wreckage they had created. However, watching the aftermath from the sidelines began to lose its appeal. The initial thrill of witnessing their social and financial destruction had worn off, replaced by a quiet realization focusing on their failure would only keep me tethered to the very past I had fought so hard to escape. My life was no longer a reactionary response to Richard and Susan's choices. It was a proactive effort to build something that mattered. I sat in my quiet office overlooking the city, the carbon fiber brace no longer feeling like a medical necessity, but rather a testament to the endurance I had gained. The anger that once burned like a wildfire had settled into a steady, focused heat that I could now channel into actual construction. I turned my focus entirely toward the establishment of the Veteran Support Foundation. I didn't want to create just another generic charity. I wanted a mechanism that could fundamentally alter the trajectory for soldiers transitioning back to civilian life, especially those who returned with invisible wounds like mine. I spent weeks drafting the mission statement, legal bylaws, and operational strategies. I wanted the foundation to be a direct reflection of the values my grandfather had lived by: integrity, unwavering support, and the understanding that true strength often requires help from others to fully realize. I contacted the legal team and instructed them to allocate $5 million of the trust's liquid assets as the initial endowment. This wasn't just a donation, it was a commitment to systemic correction. My first major initiative was a comprehensive scholarship and mentorship program. I wanted to help veterans pursue professional certifications that had nothing to do with their military training. I knew from my own experience how the transition could feel like being pushed off a cliff without a parachute. We created partnerships with local tech firms, healthcare facilities, and logistics companies to offer guaranteed internships for our scholars. I insisted on a rigorous vetting process, ensuring that the foundation wasn't just throwing money at problems, but actually providing the tools and network necessary for long-term independence. I didn't want to create dependency. I wanted to build a bridge. I found myself working alongside people who understood the weight of service. My board of directors included a retired brigadier general, a clinical psychologist specializing in PTSD, and a former combat medic who had worked in the same theater as I had. Every board meeting was a masterclass in professional discipline and compassion. We debated policy, analyzed impact metrics, and held ourselves to the highest standards of operational efficiency. My father's old business world had been about profit leverage and appearances. My new world was about results, accountability, and real-world impact. The transition was rewarding in ways I hadn't expected. Every time a recipient called to tell me they had landed a stable job or finished their certification, the old bitterness over the stolen money faded further into the background. I consciously avoided the temptation to use my influence to harass or taunt my family during this time. The tabloid reporters occasionally reached out asking if I wanted to comment on Richard's legal troubles, or if I had any words for my mother in her newfound poverty. I gave them no comment. I told Mitchell that any further interaction with my family's legal proceedings should be handled solely by the firm, with instructions to keep me informed only of the final outcomes. Revenge, I realized, was a static emotion. It looked backward at what had already been lost, demanding blood for blood in a cycle that never truly satisfied the spirit. Correction, on the other hand, was dynamic. It looked forward, building and fixing and creating. One of the most powerful aspects of this focus was the way it reshaped my daily life. Instead of obsessively checking on my family's ruin, I started my mornings with a long, challenging walk through the nearby park, followed by an hour of reading before heading to the foundation office. I hired a new personal assistant, someone who had no ties to my previous life, and we developed a professional partnership based on mutual respect and shared objectives. I began to invest in my physical health again, treating my body with the care it deserved rather than pushing it to the brink of failure as I had during my military service. I started learning how to cook simple, healthy meals, finding a quiet, meditative rhythm in the process. My friends, the ones who had stayed through the transformation, noticed the difference. Vanessa stopped checking in on me out of concern and started checking in to simply be a part of my life. We had dinners, attended small gallery shows, and took short trips to the mountains, always keeping the focus on shared experiences rather than the past. I realized that by letting go of the need to crush my family, I had made space for a life that was surprisingly rich and full. I was no longer defined by the betrayal or the subsequent victory. I was simply Liam, a man who had survived a war and a family of predators, and who was now choosing to spend his days building a legacy of service. The temptation to lash out remained a quiet whisper at times. Occasionally, I would see a headline about Richard's latest court appearance, or a photo of a garage sale where my parents were selling the last of their belongings, and that old familiar rage would try to flare up. But I would take a deep breath, look at the latest foundation report detailing the number of veterans we had placed in jobs, and that heat would dissipate. I had learned that the highest form of justice wasn't punishing them. It was becoming so undeniably successful and fulfilled that they could no longer exert any influence over my psyche. They had tried to break me, and they had failed. Now, I was proving that I wasn't just a survivor, but a person capable of profound, meaningful growth. The house of cards had fallen, the dust had settled, and I was finally standing on solid ground, ready for whatever the next chapter had to offer. Section 18, 1,000 words. The final resolution arrived in the most mundane way possible. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a day characterized by typical Seattle drizzle that turned the city into a blur of slate and silver. I had just left a high-stakes board meeting regarding the Foundation's expansion into the Pacific Northwest. I was walking toward the parking garage, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction with the progress we had made. My stride was confident and fluid, the carbon fiber brace functioning perfectly. As I turned the corner near the entrance to the garage, I nearly collided with a man huddled under the narrow overhang of an adjacent office building. He was wearing a threadbare coat that clearly hadn't been dry cleaned in months, and his posture was alarmingly hunched, as if he were trying to occupy as little space as possible in the world. When he looked up, the recognition was instantaneous and suffocating. It was Richard, my father. The transformation was not just dramatic, it was complete. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by worn layers that couldn't mask the reality of his decline. His face was etched with deep lines of stress and genuine defeat, his eyes reflecting a hollow, desperate exhaustion that was entirely devoid of the imperious arrogance I had once feared. He stood trembling, his hand reaching out instinctively toward me, before he caught himself and shoved it back into his pocket. He looked like a man who had been stripped of every defense he had spent a lifetime constructing. "Liam," he rasped. His voice lacked its former booming authority, sounding brittle and thin. "I didn't expect to see you here." I stopped a few feet away, keeping my distance. I wasn't afraid of him, nor was I angry anymore. The sight of him was merely a stark reality of the consequences he had invited into his own life. "I work in this area," I replied, my tone steady and completely neutral. Richard stepped forward, his eyes searching my face for any sign of the old, impressionable son he had successfully manipulated. "I've had a lot of time to reflect lately, Liam." He began, his voice taking on a familiar practiced lilt, a ghost of the oratorical style he used to use to dominate family dinners. "The legal proceedings have been enlightening. I've realized that perhaps my focus was too heavily weighted toward the business, toward securing our status. It's easy to get lost in the pursuit of success. I made mistakes, yes, but those mistakes were driven by a desire to provide for this family." He was attempting to initiate the old dance. He was trying to frame his crimes as mere parenting missteps, shifting the burden of his failure onto a generic narrative of overzealous ambition. It was a classic Richard maneuver: justify the act by citing the outcome and blame the victim for not appreciating the effort. "You aren't just reflecting on business mistakes, Richard," I said, using his name instead of father, a clear declaration of our current standing. "You're reflecting on the fact that you stole money, committed fraud, and chose to prioritize your image over the health and safety of your own son. That isn't a mistake. That's a fundamental breach of every principle a father should stand for." Richard's face hardened for a split second before returning to a mask of tragic vulnerability. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn notebook. "I've started writing things down," he said, his hand shaking. "I've been trying to put together an account of everything. I want to make it right. If you would just sit down with me for an hour, just 1 hour, we could work out a way to repair what's been broken. Your mother, she's so isolated now. She needs to know that we're moving toward reconciliation. It would be a healing moment for all of us." His voice was dripping with manufactured sincerity, the same tone he'd used to convince my mother to abandon me at the airport, or to convince business partners to sign off on his fraudulent loans. He was still trying to maneuver me, still trying to leverage the concept of family healing as a bargaining chip to stabilize his own precarious social standing. I looked at him not with disdain, but with a profound final clarity. "You don't want reconciliation, Richard. You want absolution. You want to feel better about your life, and you think that if I sign off on it, you can sleep better at night. But I'm not here to grant you peace of mind. I am your father." He snapped, the arrogance briefly flickering back into his eyes before he checked himself. "Doesn't that count for anything?" "It counts for the fact that I'm standing here instead of walking past you," I replied firmly. "But it doesn't buy you a pass. My life is built on work, honesty, and foundation. Yours was built on deceit, vanity, and theft. The two don't align. I'm not punishing you. You're living the exact life you created through your own specific choices. I had nothing to do with your bankruptcy or your legal battles." Richard slumped, his shoulders dropping even lower. He looked small, a man who had reached the end of his tether and found no support waiting for him. "So this is it then? You're just going to let me walk away into nothing?" "You aren't walking into nothing," I said, my tone as cold and clear as the rain hitting the pavement. "You're walking into the reality of who you truly are. I have my own work to do, my own foundation to lead, and a life that doesn't include the toxic cycles of our past. I wish you the best in your legal matters, but I'm not interested in being part of your story anymore." I turned away from him, my heart rate steady, my breath even. I didn't glance back to see his reaction. As I walked into the garage, I felt the final weight of our shared history dissipate entirely. I had come to this spot as a man prepared to deliver a verdict, only to find that the verdict had already been rendered by time and circumstance. There were no further negotiations to conduct, no additional lessons to teach. He was a relic of a life I had discarded, and as I drove away, I didn't feel a hint of regret for closing the door forever. The final resolution was simply this: I was finally truly free. Section 19, 1,000 words. The drive home was quiet, devoid of the frantic energy that used to accompany every interaction with my family. I parked the car and walked into the farmhouse, the silence now feeling like a deliberate restorative choice, rather than a void to be filled. I sat on the back deck, the same place where I had first processed the news of the trust and the devastating betrayal. My leg felt strong, supported by the carbon fiber brace, but more importantly, my mind felt clear. I looked out over the vast pastures now slowly waking up as the seasons began to turn, and I thought about the label Richard had once branded me with. He had called me a burden, a broken liability that served no purpose in his carefully curated status-driven world. For years, I had believed that version of myself, a fragile, discarded soldier whose value was measured only by the money he could generate for the family empire. But the journey I had endured from the blistering heat of the combat zone to the cold betrayal of that Christmas Eve had burned away the impurities of that false identity. The burden Richard perceived was actually a foundation of tempered iron. Every grueling mile I had marched with a heavy pack, every medical procedure I had undergone, and every night spent in isolation after my father's rejection had been building the architecture of who I was meant to become. I hadn't been a burden. I had been a foundation, the only thing holding together the illusion of their success for far longer than they deserved. The irony was that the very resilience they sought to break had become the exact strength that enabled me to survive their collapse. I thought about the painful nights during the first few months of my recovery when I could barely crawl to the kitchen without agony. Back then, the pain felt like a malicious force, an endless punishment for my service and my choices. Now I saw that pain as a necessary catalyst. It had forced me to slow down, to strip away the distractions of my former life, and to confront the uncomfortable realities of my upbringing. Without that physical and emotional crucible, I might still be chasing the approval of a man who viewed his own children as disposable assets. The betrayal hadn't been a detour from my life. It had been the primary engine of my evolution. It had dismantled the life I was expected to lead and gave me the absolute clarity required to build a life worth living. I opened the Foundation's latest impact report on my laptop, but I didn't focus on the numbers or the logistics. I focused on the stories. There was the account of a young medic who had returned from overseas with a shattered spirit, finding purpose through our mentorship program. There was the story of a veteran's family who had finally found the legal and financial footing to start their own small business because of the scholarship support. These stories were the real return on my investment. They were proof that trauma, when processed with intention, could be transformed into a powerful source of growth. I wasn't just fixing the financial mismanagement of my past. I was creating a ripple effect of stability and hope. My father's life had been about accumulation, collecting properties, building assets, maintaining the appearance of authority. His tragedy was that he never realized the only things that truly held weight were the connections we forged and the integrity we maintained under pressure. He had spent his final years of professional dominance chasing the validation of people he didn't even like, all while losing the only thing that could have actually sustained him when his empire inevitably crumbled. I had lived through the collapse of that empire and emerged on the other side with something he had never possessed, a core of unshakable authenticity. I stood up and walked to the edge of the deck, looking out toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in deep hues of violet and orange. I had no illusions about the future. I knew that life would continue to present obstacles, new projects, new challenges, perhaps new losses, but I was no longer afraid of the breaking points. I knew what it felt like to be shattered, and I knew the process of putting the pieces back together into something more resilient. My father had tried to use me, but he had inadvertently provided the training required to surpass him. He had been the master of illusions, but the truth of his downfall was the most authentic lesson I ever received. I walked back into the kitchen, the space I had made my own. I wasn't the broken son anymore. I was an architect of my own destiny, guided by a past that had tested my limits, and a present that allowed me to lead with a clear, honest vision. The pain of the previous years hadn't been a waste. It had been the price of admission for the freedom I was now experiencing. Every drop of sweat in physical therapy, every difficult legal confrontation, every sleepless night, mourning the loss of the family I thought I had had, all served to solidify my purpose. I was finally truly and undeniably the man I was meant to be. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely at home in my own skin. The journey had been harrowing, but I had reached the other side and the view from here was beautiful. The final chapter of my journey didn't end with a grand declaration or a public speech. It ended in the quiet, mundane reality of a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at the same kitchen table where I had once been humiliated. I had spent years obsessed with the definition of family, an obsession fueled by the toxic need for validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of offering it. My biological family had acted as if blood was a contract, a binding obligation that demanded my loyalty, my labor, and my silence, regardless of how they chose to treat me. They had used that belief to exploit my service, and to justify their own cruelty, framing every act of betrayal as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of their image. But the reality I had discovered was entirely different. Family isn't a debt you are born into, and it isn't a status you inherit through a name. I realized that the true measure of a family is found in the simple, often invisible act of showing up. It is found in the neighbor who calls emergency services when they hear an alarm not because they are required to, but because they care. It is found in the friends who sit with you in a hospital room, not because they are obligated by shared DNA, but because they genuinely value your existence. It is found in the people who offer a hot meal or a kind word or a space to breathe when the walls of your life are collapsing. These people, these strangers turned allies, had provided more authentic support in a few months than my biological family had offered in 3 decades. They hadn't asked for my money, they hadn't demanded my silence, and they hadn't used my vulnerabilities as weapons to keep me under their control. This discovery was the ultimate inheritance. It wasn't the billions in the trust or the ownership of a gleaming corporate plaza. It was the freedom to curate my own circle of belonging. I had replaced the transactional, conditional nature of my past with a life defined by mutual respect and genuine concern. This realization didn't erase the pain of my upbringing or the sting of my family's betrayal. Those memories remained, serving as a permanent map of where I had been and a warning of where I would never return. But the pain no longer dictated my behavior, and it no longer defined my future. It had become a scar, a sign of survival, that was now just a part of the landscape of my story, rather than the primary plot. I thought about the young veterans we helped through the foundation, those who arrived at our doors feeling just as discarded and burdened as I had felt on that bus ride years ago. They too were struggling with the dissonance of being labeled burdens by the very society and families they had served. My purpose was to show them that their military service hadn't emptied them of value. It had merely highlighted the inadequacy of the systems and people who failed to support them. We weren't just providing jobs or scholarships, we were providing a community that recognized their inherent worth. We were showing them that they too had the power to create a foundation out of their own rubble. If you are listening to this and finding yourself caught in the suffocating trap of a toxic family dynamic, please understand that your worth is not a variable to be calculated by someone else's opinion. You don't have to carry the burden of their expectations, and you certainly don't have to accept being treated as a secondary character in your own life. The hardest, most terrifying step is often the one that takes you away from the table, where you are no longer being served or respected. But standing on the other side of that distance, I can promise you that the air is clearer, the ground is firmer, and the horizon is wide enough for you to build exactly what you desire. You are not a burden. You are not a liability. You are the architect of your own peace, and you have the absolute right to evict anyone from your life, who refuses to honor the space you have worked so hard to build. My father, Richard, and his downward spiral no longer occupied space in my daily thoughts. He was a man who had chosen a path of deceit, and the outcome of that path was his alone to navigate. My mother was someone who had lived in fear of being discovered, only to be ultimately defeated by the reality she had spent decades fleeing. They hadn't been defeated by me. They had been defeated by their own refusal to acknowledge the basic humanity of their own child. I had won not by destroying them, but by simply outgrowing the small, miserable role they had cast me in. I had moved on to a life where I was a participant, not a project to be managed or a resource to be harvested. The journey from that cold Christmas dinner to this moment of absolute quiet certainty was the greatest achievement of my life. I had walked through the fire, emerged on the other side, and rebuilt my identity on the bedrock of my own integrity. I was finally truly free, not just from their influence, but from the desperate, hollow need to prove my existence to people who had never truly looked at me. So take this message with you. You are the author of your own worth. Do not let anyone edit your story. Have you ever had to walk away from people you were told you had to love? Have you ever had to build a family from the ground up because your biological one couldn't support you? Share your journey in the comments below. If this story offered you any semblance of hope or clarity, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience. Thank you for listening to my journey. Remember, you deserve to be surrounded by people who show up, who support you, and who value the person you are, not the person they want you to be. Your future starts the moment you decide your own value is non-negotiable. The story of Liam offers a profound lesson on the difference between familial obligation and true worth. For years, Liam believed that his value was tied to his ability to support his parents and sister, accepting their cold dismissal and manipulation as the price of belonging. The turning point in his life wasn't just the betrayal itself, but his decision to stop viewing himself through the distorted lens his father had forced upon him. He realized that a family defined solely by blood and transactional loyalty, where one is treated as a burden when they can no longer provide, is not a foundation but a cage. The realization that true security comes from within and from the authentic community one chooses to build is the most important lesson. Liam learned that when you refuse to accept the role others have scripted for you, you gain the power to write your own narrative. His journey teaches us that trauma and betrayal are not final destinations. They are the raw materials for a stronger foundation, provided you have the courage to walk away from toxic dynamics. True family is not defined by DNA. It is defined by the individuals who show up when things are at their worst and who value you, regardless of your financial or professional utility. By setting firm boundaries and prioritizing his own integrity over the approval of those who sought to exploit him, Liam finally found a sense of peace that no amount of money could buy. If you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic that drains your spirit, remember that you have the right to create your own space and define your own worth. Start by setting one firm boundary today to protect your peace.